Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stepping into the engine room of human identity. We're pulling apart the gears to answer a question that has, divided political theory, psychology, and sociology for centuries. It's an inquiry that sits at the very base of how we organize our lives, our laws, and our societies. The question is this: are human beings the autonomous architects of their own character, the masters of their own destiny, or are we, in fact, the products of our circumstances molded by the collective environments we inhabit?
And that is the eternal tension, isn't it, between the I and the we. And I think it's important to state right up front that this isn't just some, abstract philosophical exercise for dusty academics. This tension is alive. It dictated the labor laws of the Industrial Revolution, it fueled the dense political philosophies of thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, and it's currently playing out in the modern structures of things like Service Canada, the preservation of indigenous languages, and even the debates surrounding the Indian caste system.
Precisely. So we're looking at the spectrum between individualism and collectivism. For our discussion, I'm going to take the position that human character is fundamentally shaped by circumstance. I'll argue that because we are products of our environment, pieces of a larger puzzle, society functions best when we prioritize the common good, shared responsibility, and structural support.
And I'll be coming at it from the other side. I'll be arguing for the individualist perspective, that human beings are rational agents defined by personal liberty. I believe that society's role is to protect individual rights rather than to try and socially engineer human character. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the idea that we are merely clay waiting to be sculpted by the state. That road leads to stagnation at best and, tyranny at worst.
Well, I see why you prioritize agency, but let me give you a different perspective, starting with a very tangible example from history. We need to look at Robert Owen. In 1799, this 22-year-old Welshman bought the new Larnach Mills in Scotland. Now, you have to understand the context here to see why this matters. Life and work in Britain at that time were described in the historical record as hard and squalid. It was the height of the Industrial Revolution's brutality. Long hours, dangerous machinery, rampant alcoholism, zero safety net.
It was certainly a bleak period for the working class. I don't dispute that.
But Owen set about creating what has been called a pocket of utopia. He operated on a very specific premise. A person's character was down to the circumstances around them. And that is the core of my argument today. He didn't just preach this, he proved it. He reduced the working day to 10 hours when the standard was 13 or 14. He refused to employ children under 10. He established the Institute for the Formation of Character.
The Institute for the Formation of Character, you have to admit, that name alone sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who values independent thought. I mean, it sounds like a re-education camp.
It might sound like that to modern ears, perhaps. But look at what it actually was. It was the first time these working-class children were given music, dancing, and nature study. Owen believed that if you change the circumstances through education and better working conditions, you change the individual. And he was right. Drunkenness dropped, crime dropped, productivity actually remained high. Owen showed that we are pieces of a larger puzzle. Our identity isn't generated in a vacuum. It is formed by factors like culture, language, and our environment. And because we are shaped by these external forces, we necessitate a social structure that supports collective well-being over unbridled self-interest.
That is a compelling narrative, and Owen certainly improved lives. But have you considered the counter-philosophy that was emerging even before Owen? I'm talking about John Locke. While Owen was treating people as, passive products of their environment, as vessels to be filled with good character by a benevolent landlord, Locke argued that humans are rational, intelligent, and reasonable entities. We are capable of self-determination. We aren't just variables in an equation to be managed by an overseer, no matter how kind that overseer might be.
Locke certainly championed the individual, but his idea of rationality presumed a level playing field that simply didn't exist in those mills.
But the distinction in premise is vital. If we accept your premise that we are just products of circumstance, we strip away human agency. We risk placing the group above the one to a dangerous degree. The source material references the ideological spectrum, and when you slide too far toward the collective, toward the idea that the state creates the person, you lose the spark that drives progress.
Or you ensure that the spark isn't extinguished by the crushing weight of poverty.
True flourishing comes from individualism, valuing personal achievement, private property, and the freedom to dissent. There is a great line in the material from the punk band, the Ramones, looking for something to believe in. That lyric resonates because it suggests that finding meaning is a personal journey, a search. It's not a program you enroll in at an institute. It's an active individual pursuit, and that existential search is what makes us human.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. That search for meaning you describe, it doesn't happen in a void. It happens within a structure. This brings us to the nature of humanity itself. If we strip away the collective structure, the laws, the safety nets, the institute, what are we actually left with?
We're left with freedom.
I would argue we are left with chaos. We have to look at Thomas Hobbes here. In Leviathan, Hobbes argued that the natural condition of mankind, without a common power to keep us all in awe, is a state of war, a war of all against all. In that state, life is, in his famous words, nasty, brutish, and short.
And you have to remember, Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War. His view was colored by violence and regicide. He was traumatized.
But his point stands. He believed that our natural self-interest, if left unchecked, leads to violence and competition for scarce resources. Therefore, we need a strong collective authority, a state, a society, to provide security. We give up some of that radical freedom you prize in exchange for the safety to actually live our lives. You can't be a rational agent if you're worried about being murdered for your boots.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the absolute worst of us. It assumes we're monsters who need a cage. Let's challenge that with Locke again. Locke didn't see a state of war. He saw potential. He argued that power rests with the people, with popular consent. The government's only job isn't to control us or mold our characters, but simply to protect life, liberty, and property.
Property being the operative word there.
Well, yes. Property is an extension of the self. It's what you create with your own hands and your own mind. If the collective can take that, they can take anything. When the state steps in to redistribute for the common good, they are effectively claiming ownership over your labor and your time.
But consider Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He countered both of them, and I think he gets closer to the truth. He said, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau argued that humans are naturally good. We aren't Hobbes's monsters, but it is actually specific societal structures, often the very protection of property that Locke loved, that corrupt us.
So civilization is the problem.
Inequality is the problem. The fierce protection of private property creates disparity, envy, and greed. Rousseau believed we need the general will to restore balance. It's not just about protecting your stuff. It's about aligning with the common good to ensure we aren't corrupted by the disparity your individualism creates. The general will isn't tyranny, it's the realization that my well-being is inextricably tied to yours.
But the general will can quickly become the general tyranny if you aren't careful. History is littered with regimes that claim to speak for the general will while silencing actual people. But let's pivot this to how it plays out in who we actually are, our identities. You mentioned earlier that identity is a puzzle.
Yes. Identity formation is a perfect example of why the strict individualist perspective falls short. We inherit so much of who we are. Look at language. The source material discusses indigenous languages in Canada, Inuktitut, Cree, Oji-Cree. The Assembly of First Nations Resolution 67 explicitly states that losing a language means losing a distinctive world view.
I don't deny that culture influences us. Of course, we all come from somewhere.
It doesn't just influence us, it defines the parameters of our thought. Language isn't just a tool for ordering a coffee, it's a repository of wisdom, of ecological knowledge, spiritual history. The material mentions Francophone parents fighting for education rights. They know that if their children lose the French language, they lose their Francophone identity. That preservation requires collective effort. An individual cannot preserve a language alone. It requires a community, a system, schools, legal protection. If we leave it to individual choice in a free market, minority cultures get swallowed whole by the dominant force.
That is a strong argument for community, I admit. There is value in heritage, but there is a very dark side to over-identifying with the collective structure of birth and heritage. We have to look at the Indian caste system.
Well, that's an extreme example of stratification, a corruption of the ideal.
But it is a collectivist structure in its purest, most rigid form. It defined people entirely by their birth group, scheduled castes, other backward classes, or OBC. It was a social structure that told you exactly who you were, who you could marry, what job you could do, based entirely on the group you were born into. That is the ultimate circumstance dictating character.
But that society is moving away from that.
Gupta, she explicitly says she wants to be judged on her own steam rather than a quota. She wants equal respect for what she has achieved personally. That is the cry of individualism. The goal of a free society should be breaking free from collective labels, even the well-intentioned ones, so that a person can achieve their individual potential. When you force people into collective boxes, even for their own good, you stifle the Deepika Guptas of the world. She doesn't want to be a puzzle piece, she wants to be a person.
I see the tension there, and I do respect her drive. But let's look at the economic structure, because that's usually where the rubber meets the road. You talk about own steam, but that steam requires fuel. I'm going to defend the socialist perspective as it's defined in our material, specifically the idea that resources should be used for the benefit of everyone.
The Service Canada model?
Exactly. Look at the programs: employment insurance, pensions, child benefits. The strict individualist might argue these are taxes on success, a redistribution of property. I argue these are the circumstances Robert Owen talked about. They allow people to live without fear. When you remove the terror of poverty, you actually liberate the individual to take risks, to be creative, to be a better citizen.
Or you make them dependent and remove the incentive to innovate.
I disagree. It's about stewardship. The source material references this concept from indigenous views that we are caretakers of the land and of each other. We aren't just exploiters for profit, which is often the corporate standpoint. If we pursue profit and growth above all else, we assume a position of control over the land that conflicts with that traditional relationship. Collective structures like public health care or pensions are modern forms of stewardship. They say, we are in this together. Your fall is my fall.
That sounds comforting, but I worry about the hidden costs of all this care. The material brings up Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher. He talked about the global village, and the medium is the message.
How does McLuhan relate to economic collectivism?
Because in a highly collectivized, media-saturated society, which is what the global village becomes, the individual loses the ability to think critically. We become consumers of a mass age, or as McLuhan punned, a mess age. The collective noise drowns out the individual signal. If everyone is tuned into the same collective frequency, where does the new idea come from?
I think McLuhan was critiquing media technology, not necessarily social safety nets.
But it's all part of the same pressure to conform to the group. And look at where real progress comes from. It doesn't come from the collective status quo. It comes from individuals challenging it. Look at the famous five in Canada, Emily Murphy and her peers.
A wonderful example of women working together.
But they started as individuals, challenging the collective law. The British North America Act didn't define women as persons. The collective wisdom of the time, the legal consensus, said women shouldn't sit in the Senate. It took individual courage to challenge the Supreme Court, to push the persons case all the way to the Privy Council in Britain. Progress didn't come from accepting the circumstances or the collective view. It came from 5 women who stood up and said, "This is wrong." That is the power of the individual. They dragged the collective forward, kicking and screaming.
I'm not convinced by that distinction. The famous 5 were a collective. They were a group. They worked within the legal system to change the system. That is the very definition of collective action. They didn't go live in the woods. They engaged with the state. And this brings us to what I think is the synthesis of our discussion, the gray area.
I agree that few issues are black and white. We usually find the truth somewhere in the middle.
The source material gives us the example of Grant McEwen.
He was the lieutenant governor of Alberta. Now this is a man who held a high office, a symbol of the state and the crown. But how did he act?
He was legendary. He jogged a mile or two every morning, ate porridge. He was incredibly unpretentious.
He refused the back seat of the vice-regal car. He cleaned his own office when the cleaning lady was late. He stopped his chauffeur to help teenagers push a minibus out of a ditch.
A true man of the people.
But more than that, he acknowledges the need for individual action. He cleaned the office himself, but he did it with humility for the community. His philosophy was, leave things better than when they were found. I argue that McEwen is the ideal blend. He's an individual acting not for personal aggrandizement, but for the collective good. He proves that you can have a strong character that is oriented toward the we. He didn't see himself as above the cleaning lady. He saw himself as part of the same ecosystem.
That's a compelling argument, and McEwen is certainly a role model. But have you considered that McEwen's behavior was a triumph of personal character, not of government mandate?
How so?
He wasn't legislated into cleaning his office. There was no Service Canada requirement for the lieutenant governor to push minibuses. He wasn't forced by a general will to help those kids. He chose that behavior.
Because his values were shaped by his community.
Perhaps. But ultimately, the decision lay with him. He exemplifies that the best service to the collective comes from a fully realized, autonomous individual. If he had been just a cog in a machine, he would have sat in the back of that car because that was his role. His individualism, his eccentricity, his personal moral compass allowed him to transcend his role to be a better human. The collective didn't make Grant McEwen. Grant McEwen made the collective better.
I see we're reaching the end of our time, and the tension remains. We began by asking if we are architects or products. As I look at the evidence from the mills of New Lanark, where Owen changed lives by changing rules, to the preservation of indigenous languages, which requires community protection, I remain convinced that we cannot ignore the puzzle pieces that form us. We are, as the philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin said, spiritual beings immersed in a human experience. We are shaped by religion, land, culture. We owe a debt to the collective that sustains us. To pretend we are entirely self-made is, in my view, an illusion.
And yet, while we live in society, the spark of innovation, of morality, of resistance, it resides in the individual. We must be wary of utopias like Owen's that demand total conformity, or caste systems that trap us in circumstances. The Ramones were right. The search for something to believe in must remain a personal quest. We cannot legislate meaning.
Perhaps the answer really does lie in that gray area we discussed. The healthiest ideology likely isn't found at the extremes of the spectrum, but in the balance.
Indeed. Balancing the I with the we.
We hope this discussion has helped you examine your own identity puzzle. Thank you for listening to The Debate.